Hearts of Iron 4 has many resources. You go into your trade here, you can see them. Oil, aluminium, rubber, tungsten, steel, and chromium. They're your main resources in Hoi4. However, there has been rumors of new resources added to Hoi to further expand the, I guess, shortages you could potentially have, or reasons to expand that you possibly have got. We're going to go through what those resources were, and maybe even kind of roleplay the idea of future resources and how they would work. If we bring up the wiki here, we can see oil. Oil used to be used for manufacturing of like tanks and planes. It used to be like a resource used to produce that said thing, but then they added the fuel thing, which now fuel is a separate resource that ticks down. Kind of works a lot like it does in Hoi 3 and Hoi 2. And it ticks down when you're using your ships, your planes, or ground vehicles. Aluminium is for construction of support equipment, as well as aircraft. I always thought it was a bit of a strange that you need aluminium for support equipment, because I feel like that limits the production of miner powers when they want to make support equipment. It almost like pushes them out of the game. I would have preferred if support equipment didn't require any equipment to make, almost like you needed like fabric, you know? But that was like not even a resource. Like every country kind of manufactures fabric as a part of like leather and the textile industries. Why can't we have production that doesn't require a resource, and it's almost like a virtual resource as such? That's potentially an extra resource, like cloth and textiles, for instance. Be aware that Hoi4 is a kind of a war game. So, of course, all the resources are kind of revolve around the war effort. Next up, we got rubber, motorized, mechanized, aircraft. I think it's really mean how much rubber is required to produce motorized sometimes. And I feel like, once again, another one of those penalties to minor powers. I wonder, in the moment of war, when there were rubber shortages, how tires were manufactured and what they were actually made out of. I wonder if they were made out of stone. It'd be like a Flintstones episode. The tungsten is a rare hard metal mainly used for anti-tank munitions, but also for machine parts and specialized parts. It's interesting it talks about machine parts and specialized parts, because that kind of implies the actual factories themselves, but you don't need any resources to make factories. That's a really key point. You don't need resources to build civilian factories, anti-air guns, or military factories. Do you think you need resources in game to produce these said things? That's something I've never even thought of. And same old tanks, artillery, more of the bigger munitions. It requires quite a lot of tungsten to produce jets as well as railway guns. Finally, the main resource in Hearts of Iron 4, the resource that I feel like minor powers should be able to tap into at any moment, but never get the ability to do, it is steel. Infantry weapons, support equipment, artillery, anti-air guns. To be fair, everything. I mean, to be honest, everything requires just a very small amount of steel, or a large amount of steel, depending on what they need. I think apart from planes. Yeah, planes. And finally, chromium, the underdog of resources. Kind of needed for like heavy production of like the larger kind of equipment in games, such as battleships, railway guns, and heavy tanks and modern tanks. One of those resources that there isn't really a high demand for. So if you're a nation like Yugoslavia that has a lot of this, it never gets traded away, which I feel like it defeats the purpose of this said resource, as well as aluminium that's used for support equipment, which I feel like has a higher demand than it necessarily needs. Chromium, on the other hand, has a lot of it, but then it's not really used as frequently. It was used quite frequently when you had more than 9 points of armor into a tank and you get 10 points, it would require 1 resource of chromium for every 9 points you put into a tank. But I'll admit, it did create a bit of a weird meta where everyone would put like 9 points of armor into a tank and never go over it because of the very high chromium cost. It almost feels like 1 piece of chromium is like too high almost. It feels like it needs a proportional amount of chromium. But in Hearts of Iron 4, it's only zeros and ones you work with. There aren't like decimal amounts of resources that get used. So it's either 0 chromium or 1 chromium or 0 aluminium. So where do we go from here? The one resource I will touch upon is copper. Copper was a resource that at one point it was brainstormed with the idea of adding it into Hearts of Iron 4, because copper is used for a lot of manufacturing of guns. It kind of is a small amount, so it's used in practically all of these items listed on the right. Let's expand upon that, because my knowledge on this is limited. And where would I ask this question? That's right, copper used in World War II. ChatGPT, tell us. Copper played a significant role during World War II, as it does in many wars and conflicts due to the importance in various industrial and military applications. Here are some of the ways copper was used during World War II. It was used as munitions and weapons, communication, electrical equipment. Oh, that's interesting. Vehicle and aircraft, armor and equipment, coins and currency, medical applications, fuel and oil lines. To be honest with you, if they ever added copper, which at this point we're so far into development, I don't think we're ever going to add any more resources. Sorry to disappoint you. But copper would be a better replacement for support equipment than aluminium, if you think about it, because it kind of falls into this category of medical applications, number 7. Copper's antibacterial properties were recognized during World War II, leading to its use in medical equipment, such as surgical instruments and hospital surfaces. What nations had problems with lack of copper? I need to put in World War II. In World War II. During World War II, several nations faced challenges relating to the availability of copper due to the distributions in supply chains, increased demand for war material, and strategic importance of certain resources. Some of the nations that are experienced copper shortage during World War II, and it just lists all the major powers. Japan does stick out to me on this one, because this is the one I was aware of. Japan's access to copper was limited due to the trade embargoes and isolation. This forced the nation to rely on alternative materials and recycling to meet its country's copper needs. For the most part, as it mentions here about supply chains, when you go to war, the demand for certain resources skyrockets, and of course the cost for it goes up as well. And with that in mind, it affects supply chains. If you play Victoria, you understand this. However, that's not what I really care about, because of course general wartime production is going to be more limited and change things due to the supply chain. What I care about is nations that don't have access to copper and they want to gain more access to it by, of course, expansion. And of course, the one I'm aware of is Japan. The mainland islands of Japan, the archipelago of Japan, is that even what Japan would be described as? Doesn't have access to much copper. And that's kind of one of the reasons for its conquest into Korea and Manchuria. And then further conquests into the Pacific, as well as the heart of China. When we got to talk about this, we've got to talk of what is the purpose of resources in Hoi4. What do they add to the game? Let's just close our eyes and just imagine if we were to remove all resources from Hoi4, what difference would that make? Well, first of all, it would mean that, for instance, Japan, as well as the Axis, would have access to unlimited rubber because it's not a resource anymore. So therefore, their production of planes is never restricted and never limited. And it also means that the United Kingdom, as well as the United States and the Allies, don't have any incentive to defend their convoys around Africa, through the Suez, through the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific. In that case, it kind of disables the purpose of Navy, even more so. So, for the most part, I think resources serve a really good function in Hoi4. Once again, resources will not be really cared about, and trading and defending certain areas of the world will not really care about in the event that those resources didn't exist. So where would copper fit into this? Copper production numbers by the major powers. So in the event of Japan getting fully embargoed, it would, for the most part, prevent them from even producing any kind of munitions of any kind. Everything else would be rationed. But would there be a penalty on the amount of soft attack that your division can deal because you've got no access to copper? I suppose in that case, if you do get embargoed as Japan, then in that case, you are completely effed. Oh, so this is an interesting breakdown. So it shows the production in tons for these certain nations. So of course, United States production is through the effing roof. Soviet Union's pretty high too. And the UK would be embargoed, Japan, Italy, and Germany. So this would be a massive nerf to the Axis. It's interesting that the nations that joined the war a little bit later, due to invasion or declaring war, are the ones that have all the production. So it's kind of in a weird way, the war couldn't really have continued if it wasn't for these two major producers of copper. Copper, thumbs up, thumbs down. Let me know in the comments below. Next up, main raw resources used in World War II. Here we go. So, steel, oil and petroleum products, aluminium, rubber, copper, iron ore. Okay, so it's moved into the ores now. But of course, iron is going to be processed until it becomes steel. Do we need the base resource that can be extracted before it makes steel? It always makes me think in Hoi4, when you're producing steel, is it like local production of steel from steel manufacturers, or are they importing the coal from somewhere else for you to produce the steel locally? So therefore, if you were embargoed, would you lose the steel production? Think about it. Because a nation could have like steel production, even though it doesn't have an iron ore and it has to be imported from somewhere else. So that's probably the reason why Paradox have never added the ability to make steel mills. Because technically, if you were fully embargoed and you had no convoys, where would you be getting iron ore from to convert into steel? I don't know. This one's a big one too, coal. So this was added in the Great War mod. But once again, it's one of those kind of raw resources, isn't it? And once again, if a nation becomes embargoed and doesn't have access to coal, all their supply chains become locked down. The problem with this list as we go down it further is we can see that there are many resources that kind of like the raw resource versions. We've got bauxite is a primary source of aluminium. It is necessary for producing aluminium when it is used in aircraft production. This comes back to the iron ore steel problem again. So once again, if I am completely embargoed and I have no access to this resource, am I able to produce aluminium? Hence the reason why Paradox have never added aluminium mills like you see in, for instance, Road to 56. Because once again, you need the raw resource. What if you're a nation in the middle of nowhere, has access to none of these resources? What would the point of that? It'd be kind of weird. Tungsten, chromium. Interesting. Chromium was used in the stainless steel production, which had various military industrial applications. Interesting. I wonder if Paradox might be artificially restricting where chromium was used to make it more of a game as such, have a purpose of that said resource. Because from my honest opinion, there wouldn't be much point adding a resource that kind of serves the exact same function of the existing resources. Like for instance, adding iron and steel, for instance. Because you're creating kind of a Victoria-style trade game in that case, and then what would the purpose of those both resources be in the game? It would just bog the game down. It wouldn't necessarily enhance the experience. Once again, this is a popular contention by the community. Everyone gets annoyed by the idea of history and fun, and like Hoi4 is a historical game. Now, I'll agree with that. There are historical elements to it, but let's just break it down for a second. A day in Hoi4 lasts about 4 or 5 seconds if you're on 5 speed. Of course, that's not what happens in real life. So of course, some elements have got to be torn away from the game to make it a fun, entertaining experience. So we still come back to what we originally said. We're always going to forgo some elements of history to make the game more fun. It all depends on where you draw the line. Is it somewhere in the middle? I lean a little bit more towards fun, but it turns out the games that are the most fun are the ones people enjoy the most, because like Battlefield and Call of Duty, even though these games might be a little bit controversial due to their arcadey elements, they're the ones that people seem to be playing the most, enjoying the most at the moment. I know that was controversial, wasn't it? You guys big mad, right? Next up, lead was used in batteries, ammunition, and other military equipment. Zinc was used for galvanizing steel, as well as production of alloys and materials. So these are like, once again, components to make steel. And lead seems like it has a bit of an overlap with copper as well, because it's used as part as a machine part, as well as military equipment, as well as ammunition. Nickel was used in production of armor, artillery, and other specialized equipment. As you can see here, guys, from looking at all of these, we've determined a lot of these are kind of like simplified. So you could say that steel is also kind of copper. It is also kind of tin and nickel and zinc at the same time. There's kind of an overlap. And to be honest with you, it would have kind of gave it more justice if it said something like raw resources. But I suppose in that instances, or raw metals, for instance, the only reason they're probably not chose to do that is because people would probably complain and say Japan had access to no copper. So therefore, why would you represent that as something that Japan has a lot of? Tin was used in solder, as well as the coating for steel to prevent corrosion. Once again, more steel production. This is an interesting one. Lumber and timber. Wonder was used for construction and packaging and other wartime needs. So if you think about it, when you're producing mills or civvies in Hoi, technically you are tapping into wood, aren't you? But then again, when you think about it, what nation doesn't have access to trees? Don't say Saudi Arabia, I get that. But for the most part, this is a resource that's kind of abundant, so it wouldn't even need to be illustrated on the map. And I think that's one of the key reasons why things like food or rations, and even ammunition to a certain degree, aren't even displayed in Hearts of Iron 4, because it's something that's so abundant that I feel like it doesn't even need to be said, and it kind of overcomplicates the game. Remember, Hoi4 is a war game, and adding something like food kind of takes away from the war element if it's such a simplified version. Hence the reason why they choose not to add it into the game. On hindsight, because a lot of these kind of have multi-functions, I'm kind of happy the way Paradox made the game. I will say one thing though. I wish chromium was used as a part of production of maybe some raw equipment at the very start of the game, just to give it function, just so nations like Yugoslavia, who have access to a lot of them, as well as Turkey as well, the Turkish fans all like this one, So therefore it can be used and built that nation's economy. But at the very start of the game, everything apart from capital ships doesn't require chromium, which is kind of a little bit disappointing to have a resource that's barely even touched into or really used in game. And my final note, my other wish list, I wish that support equipment didn't require aluminium. Can anyone rationalize this, how aluminium would be used as a part of support equipment? So what have we got here? We've got an ammunition box. So that would technically be copper and lead and zinc, wouldn't it? Then we have first aid kit, which is kind of like cloth. I suppose a very small amount of precious metals, as well as like needles and stuff, which is a little bit of metal, a little bit of steel. Really got steel there. And then finally, you've got a radio. Now, a radio is made up of lots of very, very small pieces of metal, rare metals, for instance, chromium, lead, zinc, nickel. So it's really hard to kind of like make a simplified version of what these resources were constructed of. So once again, in all fairness, the game is kind of in a way dumbed down when it comes down to raw resources, just to make the game a better, more fun experience, which it unfortunately leans more towards an arcadey game than it does like a pure historical simulator like you would have got maybe in Hoi4, which had definitely a lot more resources. But then it had a level of complexity that kind of really wasn't even required. Was it? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Regardless, they're on my wish list. If you enjoyed this kind of video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Ooh, this video. Give this one a click. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.